Bereits mit 29 Jahren hält Brad Mehldau seinen Einzug in den kleinen Kreis der Jazzgrößen. Ob Romantik oder Rock, als Bandleader oder Solist, er macht keinen Unterschied zwischen E-Musik und U-Musik. Seine musikalischen Wurzeln reichen von Brahms und Schubert bis hin zu Radiohead, Nick Drake, Coltrane, Monk und Led Zeppelin. Unaufhörlich durchstreift er Poesie, Bücher und die Straßen der Städte. Mit seiner Musik taucht er vor allem ein in seine inneren Welten. Im Januar 1999 nahm das bereits legendäre Trio, das er mit dem Kontrabassisten Larry Grenadier und dem Schlagzeuger Jorge Rossi bildet, Teil 4 von L'Art du Trio mit dem Titel Live in Village Vanguard auf. Einige Wochen zuvor kam Mehldau nach Berlin, um seine erste Solo-CD mit Klaviermusik vorzubereiten.
I want to check out Berlin, work on this new solo piano music and really dive into that and have some solitude, hopefully, with myself. And kind of go on this little descent down into something and then resurface. I'm glad we're out here in the Far East, as they call it. It's a little more real maybe than being in the hip, kind of trendy part of the city. Food's great. Heavy, lots of pork, lots of pig, potatoes. It's a strange place, I guess, but it's not that strange. People are the same everywhere you go. right after I play, I feel kind of blank, emotionally, like, but I also feel a little raw, maybe. Physically touchy, you know, like I don't want people to come right up to me, but they do. And usually that goes away after about 5 or 10 minutes. And then I just feel like, whatever, you know, back to earth.
I think I get a lot of sound from the fingers themselves, not as much from the arm or whatever, but really from the fingers. You know, really trying to feel each note as I'm playing it, you know. But hopefully I don't have to try to do that. It just kind of happens naturally, you know. Again, so I don't know if I'm mystifying everything here. It's natural. It's not either or, it's both and, you know, because I can be very involved in it, and also one part of my brain can be thinking about some really banal, stupid shit about, like, you know, I have to go to the bathroom, or, you know, did I leave my wallet in the hotel, or, you know, sometimes those thoughts are coming in too, you know. So in some sense, it's like any other thought process. You can be thinking a few different things at the same time. It's pretty specific what I'm doing, I think, especially with the trio, you know. We have the regular pulse that's going on, and then we have another pulse that would seem to be unrelated to that. And the idea is to make your phrases and your melodies in that other pulse, in that other tempo, but the time is still going by just as slow or fast from the first tempo. So you have two different tempos going on at the same time, but your form and your shape is still the same. So I think with the time, it's always a matter of retaining that form, you know, and that's sort of what makes it interesting to me, is if you can retain the form of what you're originally doing and step out of the time, but always have it in mind. So it's sort of two things going on at once, I guess.
Do you get lost?
Sometimes, I think what's great about playing with Jorge and Larry with that trio is that at various times, sometimes one of us gets lost. Almost never are we all lost together. And I think the trick is to get good at being able to find your way back again. When you get lost, very quickly realizing it and listening to the other guys where they are, and then coming back to it.
So it starts out minor and then it ends major. Back to minor. What's really fascinating to me and great about music is harmony. You know, people think a lot in terms of you know, how does an improviser or a musician or a composer sort of identify themselves? And often people think of melody. You know, what type of melody do you write? You know, can you write a great melody? People don't talk as much about harmony because it becomes a little more difficult or specialized to talk in that language about harmony, and you can sort of lose people. But harmony often is sort of the thing that's going on under the melody. And someone like, when I think of anyone from Schubert or Brahms all the way through, you know, the Beatles, for jazz, certainly Coltrane, Duke Ellington, people like that, they were really great harmonists, you know, in the sense that they wrote these great melodies, but the melodies wouldn't have been too much if there wasn't this harmony under it that oftentimes is this sort of thing that's mixing a very simple melody with harmony that's something that's not as simple, you know, sort of has a darker side to it, so it sort of mixes the two together. You know. Coltrane to me is like the jazz Beethoven, if you want to say, because he came along, you know, maybe, I mean, loosely, if Bird was Mozart, you know, because he just had this incredible naturalness, you had the feeling that it was pouring out. Coltrane was the guy who came along and did that same sort of thing that Miles did when he broke through harmonic territory and rhythmic territory and the way his band played together. It was very much about, maybe some people would say Charlie Parker was like that, but for me, I get that from Coltrane, that they're just sort of saying, they're saying two things at the same time, which would seem not to go together. His music is saying, fuck you to the audience, but in a really beautiful way. It's like, fuck you, I love you, now let me play you some beautiful music, you know? So there's this feeling like they're gonna do whatever they want and assert their own will and not worry about how it's being understood or whatever. Yet the wonderful thing about that is that it speaks to people. So then you have to ask, why is that subjective creation more beautiful than somebody else who's just playing all these notes and sort of being free or whatever? And the reason why, it's sort of, there's no mystery. There's still very strong form. There's a shape to it. Everything is coming from somewhere, and it's coming from a harmonic tradition that stems back, you know, from it contains everything that's already come before. What's really happening is he's becoming free from something that's grounded in something. There's always that ground. Sometimes it's just a pedal point, just one note down here. That's the bass. But everything springs from that and sort of organically comes from that pedal point. So when I get to my improvisation, a lot of times what I'll do is just take a little piece of the melody and then sort of fuck around with it and twist it all sorts of different ways, you know, so just that last part sometimes. And then I get to that and then move it all over the...
gotten real tired, from playing these solo concerts. Especially with these with the new elegies I'm doing. It's all my own compositions, and I'm trying to do this thing, and it sort of takes you through time, so you feel the time passing in a very intense way. There's sort of no break, and it's this big thing. After an hour, it feels like a little life and a little death has taken place, or whatever. Elegies, for me, have a nice kind of potential for a paradox, because you're lamenting something that's past, but at the same time they have the potential to celebrate whatever it was that passed. I think elegies deal a lot with making a statement on our mortality, which is always a thing, I think, that art is somehow trying to reconcile the fact that we're mortal, and music for me is sort of elegiac by nature a lot of the times, because as you're playing music, you're playing it in time, through time. That's why there's nothing like seeing a live performance, witnessing that act. Whether you're in the audience or whether you're the performer, your life is passing in real life as the art is being created. I think the hardest things to say goodbye to are really usually parts of myself that are no longer working in my life. When I was younger, and up until pretty recently, I was much more sort of a self-destructive type of person, and there was something fun about that in my youth, I think, and it allowed me to experience a lot of things. At a certain point, it stopped working, and it became sad and miserable. But when it was time to say goodbye to that, I had to sort of mourn or grieve or lament the loss of that part of my life. I couldn't just shove it under the rug, because when you try to just shove something away, you're not saying goodbye to it. You really have to acknowledge that for what it is, and acknowledge that whatever part of my life stopped working, there was something fun about that, and exciting and beautiful. So I think those are not as much specific things or people. I've lost people who are close to me in my life, and that's always difficult. But more parts of yourself that you have to let go and grow. trio, you're very much communicating with these two other people that are there and communicating with the audience. When you're playing solo, you're just communicating with the audience and with yourself, I guess, you know. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to talk about what it means to be a leader, I'm technically the leader. I guess just simple, really basic, pragmatic shit of bringing some material, writing the material, and choosing some standards that work. You know, just the material. That's sort of the basic thing, you know, and the sets. You know.
I think it's a little more than that.
Yeah, it is.
Basically.
Yeah.
I mean, cause I think, you know, leader really has to be the source of inspiration, you know, especially when maybe when it's not happening elsewhere. Then that's what with Brad, I feel like he's you know, inspiration is just gushing out of him, you know, and ideas are pouring out of him all the time. And so that's a source of inspiration for us to play against and play with.
If I had to make a super broad generalization about you, which I do when people ask me, I say, well, he's extremely open with rhythm and time, yet he gives me something that a bass player, I really want to hear from a bass player, which is a bottom, you know, like not necessarily playing the roots a lot, but playing something that resembles a root for whatever we're in, and giving me a bottom that I can jump off of. But even that would be too general because you're not doing that all the time, right. You know. What happens with Rossi is he gets dark on the way he played after the gig, and he was fucking great. But what happens is, well, in my opinion, you think too much, you know. You're taping the gig all the time. You haven't been doing that.
No, somebody else is doing it.
Someone else is doing it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he got this fucking mini disc man that he started carrying around when we were touring in France a few months ago. And he's taping every gig.
Well, I have to do something during the rest of the day, you know, just sitting around in the hotel, you know. I need to suffer a little bit. It's not going to be all just watching movies and stuff.
Right. For me, I like to play and just forget about it as soon as it's done with it and move on to the next night, you know. Unless we're in a situation like this where we're recording, and then I'm going to go and obsess on the stuff and listen to it every night and try to figure out takes and everything.
But much later.
Much later, yeah.
You know, I have to admit that when I was doing it every night is too much. Yeah, maybe I can do it like once a week or tops, yeah. Right. Yeah, because then it's bad, you know. I started reacting to what I played the night before instead of just being on the moment.
Right. And you're even more like that. You really don't need to hear.
I don't want to.
You haven't even heard our records. Have you heard our records?
Are they out? He's never listened to our records.
They released?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I was there. I know.
You were there. Right.
It's so free, this music, you know, even though we're playing, you know, what people would call, you know, inside, as far as we're playing standard songs, we're playing in time and with the form and all that. For me, it's very free music, and so I feel like I can play anything at any time. So I don't really think of it in those terms of having a role, you know.
Yeah. It's really hard to answer that question, you know, 'cause
I mean, in other bands, I probably could answer that easier.
Yeah.
But this, especially trio, you know, it's so fluid. It's, you know, somebody's voice will be on top, and then it'll switch, and that, you know, somebody else will be on top, or it'll be like a dialogue, or three people talking at once.
Just very fast, someone will present something, and then the other two catch on to that very quickly. So a lot of the success or failure of it is how quickly the other two catch on to that, and then you're in that, and so it can seem, you know, so it is effortless. That's what I love about these guys.
Bye.